So again, we are gathered here to spend some time with our last best act, which is a fairly recently released book by Mallory McDuff. Mallory, again, thank you so much for joining us in this Conservation Burial Alliance cocktail conversation, which is happening during the month of Lent, which seems like I don't know, kind of ironic and perfect at the same time.
It does seem perfect. Yeah, it totally. I've had my first like NAIPA, which I thought I would never do. But
they've gotten better, I hear.
But yeah, that's what well, it's so great to be here, and I'm just super appreciative of everyone taking the time to share who you are. It does seem like we may have one person still not muted. Maybe Lynn.
It could be Lynn and Alyssa. Do you mind muting for this next part?
And it's fine, except I was getting Alyssa, I don't hear, but Lynn, I was getting some feedback. And yeah, but that's good. That takes care of it.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And so yeah, should we jump in to
let's jump in. I just wanted to say thank you and so appreciate your offering in this time and in this work. So I read this book in sort of probably 2 to 3 big bites, because I think, as Sarah mentioned a little bit earlier, as Frances mentioned, it's very compelling, and I wrote down some thoughts along the way, and I'll sort of will share with the group. If folks have questions as we go, just put them into the chat, and we'll make sure that we get a little bit of time for that as we are going. Mallory, do you want to, just for the sake of formality, kind of give whatever sort of introduction feels right to you of yourself and this process of creating this book?
Definitely. Yeah, I want to jump into that. So my name is Mallory. I am sitting here in my kitchen it's a little 900 square foot rental duplex at Warren Wilson College, where Ruby will be a student in the fall. And I have taught environmental education here for 22 years, which has now gotten to the point where when I tell that to my students, I can see their faces, because it's more years than they've been alive. But this has been a really great place for me and my 2 daughters, who are now 22 and 16. So they've been raised on this campus with students as babysitters, with the campus as their place where they've run around, and so it's been a great place for us. I grew up in Fairhope, Alabama, on the little bit of coastline that Alabama has. And anybody who has dug into the book, will realize that my family story really centers the book. But before I share a bit about that, I just wanted to say that my background is, I actually went to the University of Florida for graduate school, and so feel very close to Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery, because I have a lot of friends in Gainesville, some of whom helped to start that burial ground. And my background's in environmental education, but I got into that through the Peace Corps. So I was in Central African Republic for about 4 years in my mid to late 20s. And that's where I discovered the field that I could teach, but also be outside. And Warren Wilson has been a great place for that. I've written several other books about the intersection of spirituality and climate change, or spirituality and environmental stewardship. My faith background is I grew up Episcopalian, and that's been a big part of who I am. So in terms of Jody had asked just for me to start out by sharing a little bit about how this book got started and the research process. And as you can see if you read the first page of the book, my parents' deaths were what really were the springboard for this research, but it wasn't automatic. I basically, as a writer, I started writing essays about my parents years ago. Like my first one was in Catapult, which is a literary journal. And it was like I just couldn't stop writing about them. You know, my friends would be like, "Oh yeah, another essay about your mom and dad," and and that, I think, is telling you something, right? If you're drawn toward a subject or drawn toward work. So I was getting something from writing about them, and this was in the years. This wasn't immediately after their deaths, but the short of the long is that my mother was killed in a biking accident. She was biking and a teen driver was driving, and she died immediately. And in the month after her death, my dad sat us down with very clear 2-page single space directives. And we didn't have, you know, the word green burial, natural burial. It was burial as he understood burials had happened, you know, prior to, you know, he knew he didn't want embalming, and he found out his neighborhood cemetery didn't require a vault. And so we grew up kind of hearing this. He built a prototype of a pine casket, like when I was in middle school. And, you know, now that I have a 16-year-old and a 22-year-old, I realize, like, he was saying all this, you know, when you're not paying attention as a kid, you're absorbing something, you know? And so when he actually did share his directives, it wasn't this like out of the blue context. We had some background and some history of him talking about this. But he, 2 years later, after my mom's death, was killed in a very, what I call a mirror image accident, biking, hit by a teen driver. We had those directives to ground us and give us momentum. And that's what propelled, you know, this, my interest in natural burial, as well as other options. The book is not just about green burial. So that's a little bit about an introduction, at least.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I think it is one of the things that really struck me about your book and this writing is how grounded it was in like your personal lineage and in that legacy, that very practical legacy from your father. Like that's pretty incredible. One of the first things that came to mind for me in reading was, I'm always curious about processes and how, like, when things like a sudden death or a pandemic, say, come along, just hypothetically, and it seems like you were well underway in the research and exploration, and then all bets are off. Can you speak a little bit to that part of this process?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question. And, you know, as a teacher and a mother of young people, you know, the pandemic has, I mean, obviously everybody's lives have been affected on some level. But I did find within my friends who had like toddlers, and the friends, including me, who had teenagers, you know, there's a little competition of like, who's got it worse. And the toddlers, you know, it's just logistics, like who's going to watch the child while you work. And the teenagers, it was, you know, the impacts of being on a couch with a screen for you know, 14, 15-year-old are long ranging, and they're not fixed by, you know, an ice cream cone or a babysitter. So I was I feel, I guess, that I share that to say that, you know, the pandemic for me as a teacher around young people who are also, you know, they were in high school, you know, a year ago. So this is, and we've, you know, been teaching hybrid, in person, you name it. We've been in person for 2 years though, or a year and a half. So I feel those impacts in a very embodied way. I will say that the research for the book had started. I mean, I would not have been able to do everything I did at the fairly breakneck speed in terms of like immersion experiences if I had started the book a year later. So, and you get that sense, which you picked up on, Jody, is that like I volunteered at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary with Cassie Barrett, and that was like the summer, it was like a full year before pandemic. I went to the body farm at Western Carolina University. That was the fall before pandemic. So I had a year, 11 months or so of research and writing. And then for me felt like the pinnacle was this experience at Warren Wilson Cemetery. One, because I had no idea that this was gonna, I had my little outline, and the best things often, sometimes, not always, but happen when you don't know that that's gonna happen, in terms of a book, like I had no idea how the story was gonna end. And it did end during pandemic on a Zoom call with the trustees of the cemetery. And it was powerful in the sense that I had been pushing and advocating for a year with someone who was much older than me. And I'm 56, like no one I know thinks I'm young, but he did, the eldest trustee and an elder of the cemetery. And so that dynamic did take a very, it was poignant. We were having this Zoom call talking about my request for an exemption. And then they went and had an in-person meeting at the cemetery, and I wasn't there, of course. And there was poignancy to that feeling of connection and feeling of frustration. So all that was a part of it.
Yeah, I'm wondering also, like, I know for myself that being in this work, I'm definitely like mortality and thinking about end of life is like it's in the soup always somewhere. But the edge of that, the pandemic brought very, very sharp, I guess. So I wonder if there was like some extra potency in what the wrapping up of this process was for you with that.
Well, I mean, when I wrote chapters, and then I was having people read chapters that featured them, and the funeral directors, it was a different ballgame, from when I'd interviewed them and hung out with them and gone to home funerals with people who also did home funerals in addition to their work with their funeral home. And my story felt super relevant because there's no one in pandemic whose lives have not been touched by the possibility of death. And those folks who were handling bodies when we thought we didn't know, there's so many unknowns, just the gravity of them maybe not being able to do things as they'd wanted to in terms of how to honor that body, felt devastating. And so while I wasn't on the inside of that, I was sharing their stories, and their stories had changed in a very, very big way. Yeah.
Well, to be in the before times and hearing, what they have to share, and then to be sharing what you've synthesized from that with them in the during times, I feel the potency of that.
Yeah, well, it did feel in some ways like I wrote about one funeral director who was very well known for, super not alternative, progressive, et cetera. And I referenced how they'd had to, I don't know, not do a certain, some things that they normally did. And I thought it was just like, this sentence was, oh, this is what you had to do. And when the funeral director read it, she was weeping. And I, like what I thought was like, oh, this is just what you had to do. For her, it was exhaustion too. And, I ended up editing the sentence because I had no idea the pain of the disconnect.
Yeah.
Because I'm not in that. Yeah.
You know, as you're speaking, I'm remembering, I think the first burial we did after lockdown was for a friend of mine, Irv, who was an old hippie and came to us just in a sheet. Actually, it was a quilt, and he'd had his toenails painted to match the quilt. It was amazing. But we didn't have any guests, and we had just gotten some like reserve PPE from somebody, you know, and we're in like visors. And I had known I was going to be burying Irvin for about 7 years, you know, but it was so different than the way that I had wanted to bury Irvin.
Right.
Really,
well, and it potentially also, we didn't know, is this potentially, you know, what are the health impacts for you? Like that, we did not know. So all of the above.
Yep, very much so. You were talking a little bit about being the mother of young people during this time, and also being the teacher of young people during this time. And I was really struck by how climate change and climate crisis themes wove through this book in a way that wasn't like banging you over the head with it, but was really kind of underpinning. And I know that for many people who are interested in natural burial and conservation burial, it's because of a deep love and belief system that's for the planet. I mean, there's many more eloquent ways to say that, but I'm curious if your process in writing this book and also teaching environmental education, like how did that end up blending for you in the classroom?
I'm only pausing in the, I have this very old answering machine that doesn't turn off. So I've got to figure this out, because usually I just call my friends and say, don't call me, there's a call, but this is a robocall from school. So I went to college with the principal though, who's talking now. So
I can keep talking while I can talk over.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's just a little background noise. She's done now. So you know, for me, as someone who's not, I'm not a scientist, you know, I'm an environmental educator, and there are environmental educators who are much more well trained in the science, in the natural sciences and climate science and whatever. You know, I'm well trained in the educational world, and I've been teaching environmental education for, you know, for several decades. But I approach the climate question very much from the perspective of how can we connect climate to values that people already have. And it's very much in the spirit of, I don't know if anybody's read or seen Katherine Hayhoe's, either her books. She's a climate scientist at Texas Tech University. She's also the climate scientist for the Nature Conservancy, the main person. She's written a book called Saving Us, and it's like a climate scientist hope for healing in a divided world or something like that. But it's, her whole thing is the most important thing you can do about the climate is to talk about it. And you know, I cite research in the book about, you know, the percentage of people that don't talk about or hear people talk about climate in their everyday lives. That's changing, but it's only changing because of, you know, unprecedented disasters that are in flooding and climate wars, like we're seeing, you know, in Ukraine right now. So I really wanted to see how I could integrate climate, you know, into the narrative with a connection to the values that people already have. And in my classes, kind of how that plays out is I do try to figure out because students sort of feel so overwhelmed, as many of us do, with the climate crisis. It's like, so what are things that, like talking about it, that's something everybody can do. You know, planning your final wishes, that's something everybody can do. And those are, and I do believe that individual acts in collective can create momentum. So if I didn't answer your question and I was distracted by that, you feel free to tell me.
No, I think you did. I was giving it a pause because the weight of that sentence I needed to sit with for a minute. That individual acts collectively can create momentum. Thank you.
Well, and that is how social change and environmental change happens, is individual acts and collective.
Yeah.
That's how any change happens.
Yep. Hope. Just reaching for it. Reaching for it.
I don't know, I think sometimes you feel it and sometimes you don't, and you just get up and keep going, like, if you can.
That's about right. Yes. So you talked, one of the things that really struck me, thank you, Heidi. She got that sentence in the chat.
Well, I would, we can put in the chat too, Catherine Hayhoe. Her book is called Saving Us. It's a great book.
Heidi, will you write that down? So you mentioned, oh, thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, perfect.
You mentioned during kind of an introduction, and this is one of the things that really struck me also, is that this is a family story that you're telling. But it is also like, you get to the end of it and there is a nice fat chunk of research and cross-referencing. And it was so gently told in some ways that it didn't sink into me until I saw that part of like, wow, this is an academic who is doing this also. Like, so thank you for writing an academic book in a very human voice.
Well, I didn't want, like, I wanted the notes to be not footnotes that people could see, but endnotes that then if you could go to the back and see, and who read the whole book, way later than I probably needed her to read it earlier, but I hadn't asked her because she's so busy. But I asked her to blurb the book, Lee Webster. And so of course she diligently read it and then sent me, 3 pages of just things that there would be no way I could know.
Yeah.
It's not in the literature, and even though like different other people had written, Cassie had read it, but she would just say like, okay, this is what this report says, but actually it's this, and you should reference this. I was freaking out a little bit because the book was, about to go to press. At the same time, I was so grateful. She didn't have to do that, obviously, but she was not gonna, it was gonna serve her to have, to have even those small things to be, not that there aren't mistakes in the book, but she was super helpful.
Yeah, I wish we could bottle her brain or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Whatever that metaphor is.
So, probably not that.
Not that one. Something else. Anyway, we are so grateful for
exactly.
So do you feel like you set out to write this kind of book? Like, there's a process always with these sorts of things. I'm just curious about what you thought you were doing when you began.
Right. No, it's a good question. I quickly came, well, I'll tell you, it's interesting because my publisher, I had actually submitted a different manuscript. It was more of a memoir about my parents and their deaths. And the question was, how can we carry the love of those that we've lost? And folks at Broadleaf Book, the editor, read it and was like, oh, we like your writing, but we're not really doing this straight up memoir. We really like a book about death and dying from an environmental angle. And I was like, okay, I can do that. So what I ended up doing was weaving the story of my parents into the narrative, but grounding it in the research. And I quickly came upon the structure of okay, like I've always wanted to write a book where you go out and you read these books like, I'm going to try to be happier in a year. And, and I was always like, what's my thing, I could do? I don't know. But like that structure appeals to me. I'm very goal oriented, and I like that like format of a year. And then so when they said that that's what they needed, it was around the same time. Of course, I said yes. And then it was around that same time where I co-presented with Cassie Barrett at this conference that was at my Episcopal church. And it was then that I was like, holy, fill in the blank. Like, I've got to change my final wishes that are flame cremation. Like, I've got to do some. And so these two things kind of happened at the same time. And so once I got on the framework of, okay, every chapter is going to be a choice, then I was able to, okay, I can divide this up. And I knew the way I teach is by experiential education. It's by, immersion learning in the community. So I knew I'm going to go and have these experiences. And the kind of person in the back of the room for me really was my younger daughter, because it was about my parents, but as a single mom, my daughters are going to be the ones who have to deal with my body. And one was at college, and the other one was just, you asked, is this the type of book I thought I would write? If I was writing this now, like, she wouldn't talk to me like, much, and she was 14, so I was still driving her around. Those were a lot of the times these conversations would happen. Like, what do you think about, I just went to this body farm, this lab, like, this is so cool. And then she would give her feedback was usually like, oh, I'm not sure about that. And so it became clear to me that like she was the other voice in terms of my personal, and my students play a role as well. But I guess I knew I wanted to write something that was accessible and that was a story, but that I think what the editor was asking for was she wanted something that would relate to people more than just my story, which the memoir was, So she gave me permission to write this book in a way by not liking the one that I had written on sabbatical and telling me she wanted another one at the end of my sabbatical.
That was a good rough draft. Good rough draft. Now, how about a much bigger frame?
Yeah, well, and I didn't use a lot of that book, but it gave me the reassurance that what I was writing about that story had some place. So,
yeah,
I did think the story would end with me choosing to buy a plot at Carolina Memorial Sanctuary. I was like, oh, I know how this is going to end, and I was wrong. Right now,
and the book is probably better for it, and all of those things.
There's more of a uncertainty about how it will end, but when I've given talks, which I've been doing, the past couple months, but in particular now that things are opening up a little bit, people, I actually haven't said like, what did you finally decide? And I've been like, look, that's the one reason to buy the book. Just kind of jokingly, but really the take home is that these things, we got approval for the Warren Wilson Cemetery to not require vaults, but what we haven't done is what you all do is, figure out the logistics of, okay, if somebody wants to do this, who's doing everything, and at Carolina Memorial, it's you get the body there and everything's taken care of. It's all the work y'all do. And that is, I guess my point is my decisions could change based on just the logistics. So the fluidity of it is one of the take homes for me of like, this is evolving, which I didn't realize before.
I feel like that was one of the best gifts that I received as I was coming into this field. I took a how to write a life and death plan seminar, and the instructor was just so clear about what a dynamic process it is. And so like from the introduction for me, it was like, oh, I'm going to write this thing and then I'm going to revisit it and then I'm going to revisit it again. And like she just said every 5 years, just take
Right.
another peek. And that because I feel like there's a kind of, I see it in cemetery clients sometimes who are pre-planning, where they're like, I just want to get my ducks in a row and then I don't have to think about it anymore. And
Right.
that's a subtle but significant distinction between I am living with my wishes, and they may change and circumstances may change.
Right. And availability of options may change.
Mhm.
Um,
Yep. So we did get a question in the chat that had to do with paperwork and doing your documents, and I'm trying to remember what it was here. Peek. A question about why you decided to place that section in the beginning of the book. Wondering about it being a reality check. And I guess my question around paperwork was like, what, of course, to try to cut it short, do you have any life hacks to share around that
Right.
process?
Right. You know, it's a really good question about where the placement of that chapter on documents. And I kind of went back and forth about that. But the reality was, because of pandemic, first, that course that I was signed up for was cut short. And at that point, it wasn't like, now we're like, oh, let's go to Zoom. Like, but that was back when people were like, oh my God, we don't know what to do. And so that the course was cut somewhat short. So to me, that I felt like I wanted to just, the information I had to share about it was maybe not as nuanced. And I wanted the momentum to be building toward the end about what do you do with your body. I also had done that documents class early as one of the first things. And I do think it's often when people start to enter into, I have to figure out what people are going to do with my body, like when they are filling out the forms. There's so much emphasis, I think, on like, do not resuscitate and all of these things. And so I wanted to kind of enter into that conversation from that point of the paperwork. That's a really good question.
Yep.
Oh, and
Did
the life
you-
hack thing you asked,
Yeah.
to me, I don't have any hacks around that. Maybe I can figure out my phone. That would be a good life hack, to not have my laptop right here. But I think what I was like, how am I going to talk about what I decided in terms of disposition? And my only life hack, I think you kind of alluded to when we shared thoughts about the conversation earlier, is it just hit me like, oh my gosh, I need to use the same 2-page format that my dad did. Like, and like I wrote that in, I mean, it was like no time. It came so quickly. And that's a hack probably, because I was so into it. And by the end, I was like, teary-eyed, and like in a good way. I love, I think crying is really, like, I come from criers. And so that was a hack in some ways, like use a format that feels meaningful to you, in addition to the legal documents,
That for me very much was my way in. Like, I remember taking some like bullet point notes and, kind of, but I kept feeling like I was on the outside of the choices. And it wasn't until I did it longhand to start with. It was just like, and I was writing to people. I was writing, to my loved ones, and not just like formal legal,
right,
official language. It was, and then the voice that came through, and like, I had more opinions than I knew I did,
right.
It was something about the process of writing in that real free form way. And then, for me, I ended up like transferring that into typing and maybe
Right.
formalizing it a little bit more before I, shared it with people. But as I was reading that part of the book and the letter, it was like, oh, yes, there's your heart coming through.
Right.
So
For some people, it might be a TikTok video.
Yeah. Totally. What is the form that frees your imagination?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Or right.
Yeah. One of the questions that I had for you, and you've kind of already spoken to this, but it was another of the lines in your book that really caught me. And you're talking about this as this process as looking for a map. And I was just thinking about how many different literal lands you were on along the way. Did you end up feeling like you were kind of on a treasure hunt, or not treasure hunt, but on a quest maybe?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, and it was, grounded in this region of Western North Carolina. But I think that, so definitely, I'd be like, okay, now I need to, let's look at this, this next choice. And a lot of these choices I didn't actually know about when I started the book. So I became more educated as I asked the questions. And that I appreciate that, because I didn't, I think the other take home besides talking about death is asking questions where you live, like what is available, or like so many people on the call, what isn't available, and what can I invest in terms of energy and organization, which is part of what happened to me with the college cemetery. It's like, wait, our most popular major is environmental studies, and here's the cemetery. So I do want to make sure if other people have questions, if to speak out, that I want to make sure they get a chance to ask as well, or even just comments. We have so much expertise.
Yeah, and I'm tracking in the chat right now. Sarah Williams had just wondered about whether that we had each mentioned taking a course on writing a sort of a death and dying plan, and whether there's something she can sign up for. Do you know of any existing instructors? Or
yeah, the one I did was through the Center for End of Life Transitions, which was run by Carolyn, who started Carolina Memorial Sanctuary. And I don't know what they have a website, they may be, it's Center for End of Life Transitions. And I would not be surprised if they're doing virtual programming, but I don't know that for a fact.
Yeah. If anybody else knows of any, you can throw them into the chat. We would probably all value that. And if there are any other questions percolating out there, please type them as you will.
And I'm also curious too, for just given that I may never sit in this with these iconic people gathered together, I'm curious if you have feedback for me about how I can share this book in a way that, like, with folks that are coming to your burial grounds, to your cemeteries, like that's, and even if you don't now, in terms of, I put my email in the chat, I'm interested in how do I then, part of it is writing a book, and then the second part is then getting it out to people. So,
yeah, Heidi is wondering if the Open Center in New York has an offering. Is that for like the death planning class? Good question. Yeah, I'm a big fan of resource conglomerizing. So if if thoughts come to mind, I've never heard of them, Heidi, the Open Center. She's saying they have some cutting edge ideas. And my brain is also a percolating brain. So if yours works like that too, please feel free to email me, and I can share the harvest. I know, conglomerizing. Did I just make up a word?
hey.
Right on. I verbed it.
Well, and even small things like, putting together something for newsletters, or I'm basically open to, I've been writing a lot of essays and doing talks. So whatever I can do to help share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mallory. Yeah, it can be so, like, such a focalizing point to have like a book in hand that then can expand from there, the conversation on many different fronts. I'm seeing that it's almost 5 o'clock and I want to be respectful. If that's my time. So that means it's almost 8 o'clock your time. So I want to be respectful of everybody's evenings. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more thoughts for the good of the order. Anything coming to mind? Francis is saying that they've been asked to add a bibliography to their website. Yeah, I've tried to create a resources page for us as well. It can be helpful, sort of the adjuncts. Hi, Billy. All right, well, at this point, I'm going to end the recording. Mallory, thank you for taking some time to think through and talk through some of these questions and thoughts.